If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hey all, welcome to this bonus episode. This year I spent some time at Worldcon interviewing a few interesting people. As I mentioned previously, these are out of chronological order. Today we have my interview with poet Jess Cho. They were great fun to interview and kept me on my game. Unfortunately for them, it was my last responsibility of the con and my brain was mostly liquefied. I'm so happy I was introduced to them. I can't wait to see what work they produce in the future. So anyway, here's that interview. Okay, it's me, Alan, and I am here at Worldcon 2022 on Sunday. My voice is probably sounding pretty hoarse by now. I've been doing lots of talking, way more than I normally do. I'm sitting here with Jess Cho, an up-and-coming author that I heard about on the mean streets of Worldcon. Welcome aboard, Jess.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here.
Thanks. So you tend to be more of a poet, it seems like, from the research I've done on your background. Poetry is, in my opinion, the hardest thing to write well and probably the hardest thing to sell. What about poetry drives you?
Yeah, so I did get my start in poetry. I do write both poetry and some short fiction, but yes, I definitely focus mostly on the poetry, and it's you know, sort of how I entered into the genre and speculative field. You know, as far as drive goes, it's kind of an odd thing to answer because it's always been there. It's never been like there was a turning moment where I decided, oh, I want to focus on poetry. In school, you know, when I was first introduced to it, it was just very enticing to me. It was very draw. And what I love about it is the form, like or even the lack of form. So the thing about poetry versus prose is that the things that you can do with the language becomes very much a part of the finished product itself. And while that's certainly true for prose as well, for poetry, it's almost like a distillation. It's a condensation of an idea or a single concept, or really even a series of emotions. And it's how you can convey that through sort of use of language that you might not ever get to do in prose.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I love about poetry is, and it's funny because I do this less in short form, but I know you can do it more in long form. But it's that ability to really linger on, you know, one or two even moments in time, or just evoke an emotion and really draw it out and spend time with that. So you can, you know, in a short story, you're sort of limited by words and plot, versus in poetry where you can, you know, that can almost be the meat of it, is just drawing that out.
Yeah, you can really, it's almost like a painting with words is how I would say it. Yeah. I know I used to be a bit of a poet back in the day. And also for the audience, Scott is on this interview as well. So if you hear him in the background, I forgot to mention that at the top of the thing. Scott and I went to college together like 2 eons ago. And we actually worked on the poetry magazine at college. So Scott was a poet for a while as well. And I appreciate the fact that, you know, you're willing to take the poetry route. I think it's the road less taken, honestly. You know, and I honestly, I don't read enough poetry these days. I really don't.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't. I hear that pretty frequently.
Oh, do you really? That was one of my entrances into literature altogether. For me, it was kind of like an evolution of music to poetry, then to prose after that. You know what I mean? So I guess this is the long way of saying, like, I appreciate what you're doing.
I do think, like, so I studied poetry in college, and at that time, honestly, I do feel there is a bit of elitism around it, especially when you do classical poetry. Like, I studied contemporary American poets, and because that was what was available to me at the time. But there was a very real feeling of kind of exclusivity to it. Like, you have to be very
I know what you're saying. What you're saying is there's a lot of people who can be rather stuck up about it, is what you're saying.
yes.
And you have to have read certain things, and you have to look at it from a certain perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do those things, then you're lesser than. I
Right.
totally get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And
you don't get poetry, but honestly, poetry isn't something that you're supposed to get.
right.
It is exactly what you experience from it is correct. There is
Right.
no wrong way to read poetry, but for I think a long time that was not how, in academic fields at least, that was really approached.
Absolutely. I can completely understand that. I mean, I think that's something that we ran into a lot back in college days. I can remember people literally would write to the newspaper and complain about Scott and I. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Because he was running the magazine. I was helping run the magazine, and they didn't like what we were doing, and they didn't think it was like high-minded enough or whatever.
Oh, wow.
So that is a story I don't think I've told in a lot of years.
Yeah.
You're digging into the deep stuff here. Our audience is going to be like, really? I never knew that about Alan. 40-something episodes, and he has never mentioned this.
I'm going to turn this podcast around, the interview around.
Yeah. So, what's the difference between poetry, highfalutin poetry, and speculative poetry? Or is there a difference? Or how do you see those things?
Yeah, so I actually love this question. And I don't know how really well this opinion goes over, but for me, often there is very little separation between poetry and speculative poetry. Often I look at it and I think all poetry is in a way speculative. A lot of it is use of imagery. We use a lot of metaphor and simile and comparison into things that are not grounded in what people would consider necessarily the real world or the mundane. And I feel like that's at the heart of a lot of poetry. So for speculative poetry, though, if you wanted to kind of more define that, for me, it's a lot of times when those metaphors that we use are meant to be literal. It's not like the moon and the stars. It is that. It's not like space. It's not like this fantastical thing. It is that fantastical thing. And the metaphor can still be there. Like, it definitely is still a layered and nuanced thing that you're doing. But the speculative portions are really meant to be literal within it too. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because there are a lot of people there's still a lot of people who look down on speculative poetry, and they think it's taking this, again, kind of really elitist art form and throwing a spaceship into it or throwing a unicorn into it or whatever. And to me, poetry is so accessible for exactly the opposite reason, or even exactly that same reason, is it can be grounded in so many things, but lost that train of thought. Oh, sorry.
No, I think what you're trying to say is that, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I might be, that, you can, those speculative elements are taken with a more of a literalism, I guess, than you would in any other poetry. And it's kind of just maybe grounded in the culture of science fiction and fantasy. You know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying?
A little bit, I think.
So there's all these tropes, right?
Yes.
That exist in science fiction and fantasy. So taking those elements and putting them in that painting of a poem. Mm-hmm. Is that what you mean? Am I hitting in some of the areas?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I would agree. And so a lot of my poetry tends to be mythology and folklore and fairy tale based. So what I like to do is be able to take aspects of those, very familiar aspects to genre culture and recognizable things, and build off of those. So you already have that sort of built-in relatability to it and things that people recognize, and then be able to sort of use that to draw out other concepts, just piggybacking off of those tropes, for sure. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think we started touching on this a little bit. For you, what makes a good poem?
So, art is subjective, for sure. But for me, a good poem is anything that successfully does either what it sets out to do, or something, even if it's something that the creator did not set out to do, but it's impactful in some way. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be earth-shattering or world-changing. It can just be, something that evokes emotion, something that does something neat with language and form, or even something that just makes you look at a mundane topic and kind of come at it sort of from an oblique viewpoint and perspective and change that up a little. But for me, poetry is very much grounded in feeling, in emotion. It is kind of this way to take, again, a concept or an image and really cut it down to like the absolute bare bones of it, and then just build it back up again, but different.
Mm-hmm. I love that answer. So here at Worldcon, you having a significant number of poems. I didn't count them, but there was a good list. 4 or 5 stories, some of which were flash, I believe. Mm-hmm. You've got all this published, but here at Worldcon, you're still kind of a newbie writer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
What are your aspirations in the immediate future for writing?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny because I'm a very slow writer. So I've been writing for a while, but I don't necessarily have the bibliography, like an extensive bibliography. So, I'm slowly checking things off the list. Like as far as writing itself goes, like I have some goals. I have some aims to eventually have a chapbook out, kind of building on that still, putting together work to have more of a body of work. I would really like to, at some point, do some editing for poetry, which is something I haven't done. Like, it's not a part of the field I've ever touched. So I'm kind of open for the opportunity to do like some guest editing on that end. And honestly, what I would really love to see is more community building around poetry. Because like you had kind of spoken to earlier, not a lot of people read poetry. Mm-hmm. They don't see it as an accessible form. And I would mm-hmm. really love to change that, because so many people tell me, like, when they find out that I write poetry, they're like, I don't read nearly enough, but I should. I like it. I'm interested in it. And so I'd really like to see kind of more open community around that. So I can hope to be a part of that as well.
Cool. Okay, so anyone out there looking for a guest editor for poetry, you know who to contact. For you, how is writing poetry different than writing prose?
Yeah, so, it's interesting because I was just thinking about this earlier. I think probably 4 of the pieces that I've written for prose and had published started as poems. Mm-hmm. And what happened was I had this core concept and thought that just grew out of the poem. It expanded too much. It couldn't be within prose, and I realized there needed to be more of a structure around it. Mm-hmm. So for me, poetry, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it really is that cutting down and that digging deep into very specific concepts, and just being able to stretch that out into verses and kind of have that be the whole of the thing, rather than driven by plot or characterization, which is not to say that those can't appear in poetry. They often do, and it's great. But I myself am really a narrative poet. Mm-hmm. So I like to use that kind of poetry framework to tell stories, but not through like the standard plot structure, mm-hmm. but to really, again, examine and go back to the things that sort of at the heart make them tick and pull those to the surface. And it's also interesting because English is such a rhythmic language just on its own. It's inherently rhythmic. So sometimes people will say that, prose, what's the difference between prose poetry and a flash piece? There's no difference. Or, what's the difference between a poem and just putting an enjambment into just regular prose and spacing it out funny? And honestly, I feel like if that's what the poem wants to be, then that can be what the poem is. Mm-hmm. Like there's no real rules around that. So it is really, for me, again, listening to kind of the language and the rhythm. But honestly, there's more crossover and there's more overlap between the two than I think people realize sometimes.
It's interesting. I don't think I've heard an author say that their story started as a poem before. That might be a first for me. I don't know. That's interesting. Talking about your poems being very prose-like or narrative, recently you published a poem called After the End in Fantasy Magazine. And it's kind of a poem about, and feel free to correct me if I've misinterpreted or something, but it's about what happens to the hero after the end of the adventure, right? And basically, it's to me, it seems to touch on like a little bit of like PTSD type stuff, an element of sadness to that, and maybe not having a place or a home. You mentioned home many times in the last stanza specifically. Can you talk about that poem a little bit and what inspired it?
Sure, yeah. So that poem was actually written as part of a triptych of fairy tale inspired poems, one of which is out in Apparition and one of them is still on Sub. But so the thought behind it was originally, it's after the end or after the end. So when a story or a fairy tale, closes, it got the happily ever after. Mm-hmm. And my biggest issue with fairy tales, and this is definitely coming from a contemporary, a modern reading in that context, mm-hmm. is happily ever afters often aren't. The main focus isn't necessarily the hero, but some of their the side characters or the damsels in distress or the people who didn't have really agency mm-hmm. in their own poems. They're sort of carried along and swept up by the hero in the narrative and that quest and journey. But what happens to them at the end? Right. Is that their happily ever after or is that the heroes?
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and so the poem is sort of that journey of the realization when the story's over, what happens to them? And it was sort of my exploration of taking control back and being like, well, this isn't where I want to be. This is not my happily ever after. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go find what is.
Right. Oh, okay. I love that. I'm starting to see that other now that you're mentioning it, thinking back to the poem. So do you have any tips for folks out there trying to write speculative poetry?
Yeah. So this is sort of it feels like generic information. You're going to hear this all the time, but absolutely read more poetry. I know that applies to prose. It really applies to all art, but for poetry especially, because there's so much different, diverse in form, in language, in style, in narrative. There's just so much out there. And the more you read, the more you kind of understand that there is no one right way to do it. There's no prescriptive, well, that was prescriptive, so never mind. That there's no real one way to write a poem, even when it comes to form poetry. Because honestly, I think a lot of poetry that we're seeing now is free verse. Mm-hmm. But even when it comes to form poetry, go out and read all sorts of form poetry. Go out and read all sorts of free verse, and then play with it, combine them. Realize that forms are suggestions. You can do it. By definition, I suppose you can do a form incorrectly, but if you take a form and modify it, that's still a valid poem. There's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, just read a lot and let yourself be surprised by poems. A lot of times as we kind of write them, we have an idea of where you're going, and then you'll find, and again, this happens in prose as well, but you'll find that there are so many layers to what you're writing that you might not have been aware of. But I think in poetry, it's just drawn out a little bit more because of that really use of metaphor, that use of evocative language, and honestly play with language too. Like that is, and I should have mentioned this before, but that's one of the big differences for me between poetry and prose is just the freedom of language use that you can get away with in poetry. But on the same token, you also have to be very precise with your language, because for a short story or even longer form, you have several thousand words that you can be using. But in poetry, you're limited to, a couple of pages. So every word that you use has to be carrying the weight of, 500 words in a story. And you have to be very precise on that. But also don't be afraid to, just experiment, just play,
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Excellent. So we have a couple wrap-up questions here. One question that we ask everybody always is, what is bringing you hope right now? And because our podcast is based around the idea of trying to give other people out in the world a little bit of hope mm-hmm. In these tumultuous times. So, and often guests will ask, well, how do I interpret that question? The interpretation is up to you.
Oh, what is giving me hope right now? We're living in some very, honestly, dark times right now. But the things that give me hope are seeing the people who are still out there doing the things, fighting the fights. And honestly, this has been on my mind, especially being here at Worldcon, people who are still making art, who are still creating, who are still, art is resistance. The poem that I wrote, so I wrote a poem back in 2019 and it ended up winning the 2020 Riesling Award for Short Poem. And it appeared in Apparition Lit's resistance issue. And it was about telling your story. And it was about, doing whatever it takes to tell that story. And I'm seeing that a lot now. And I really feel like we're in such a forward-moving part of genre. And that's just giving me so much hope for everything.
Yeah. I gotta show you a button I have on my backpack real quick. And for the audience, the button says "Despite everything, create," and it's from a friend of mine and also an author, Zigzag Claiborne. He sent it to me in the mail just last week or something. After I was interviewing him for one of our episodes. And yeah, I mean, I told him, he mentioned it in the episode, and I was like, I just love that so much. You know what I mean? And sometimes it can be hard, but you just gotta keep pushing ahead and make the best of it, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what do you want to promote? Do you have anything coming out?
I've got a couple of pieces coming out. And actually, they're all in anthologies. This is great, so I can promote the anthologies. One of them, they're both coming out this autumn. So one, I have a poem in an anthology called Queer Little Nightmares, and that's coming out from Arsenal Pulp Press. And that is an anthology based off of queer, monstrous pieces. It's short stories and it's poetry, but that's the entirety of the anthology. So I'm very excited for that to come out. There's some great stuff in there.
Awesome.
And the second is I actually have a short story. It's horror coming out in an anthology called Death in the Mouth, and that is all BIPOC horror stories. Okay. And each story is paired with an illustration also from a BIPOC artist, and I got to see the proofs, and this is going to be a fantastic collection.
Awesome.
Yeah, so they're both up for pre-order right now, and they're coming out in October.
Awesome.
So I highly recommend giving those a look.
Awesome. Scott, your TBR just got longer.
Yes, I know it is.
He's our resident horror fan.
Nice.
I don't do much horror, a little bit, but he's like 95% horror.
Nice.
Okay, last question. Where can we find you online?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Words by Cho, all one word. And I do have a website as well. It's not, I try to keep the bibliography updated, but it's hit or miss, honestly, these days. But it's semi-well-versed at .wordpress.com.
Don't feel bad. Our website is in a bad need of updating as well. And Ellen Datler just told us hers was as well. So you're not alone.
I'm in good company.
So thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was great.